How you doing, guys? Now that you've seen me throw up a couple of videos on the redworm bin and the redworms and composting with them, you've also seen me do videos on the soldier grub bin and how to use soldier grubs for composting. You're probably wondering which is better if you want to get into vermicomposting. Should you go with the soldier grubs or should you go with the redworms? As you know, I now have both, and I think that both of them have a place in any sort of like urban homesteading setup if you can manage both of them. But because there's a lot of overlap too in the soldier grubs and the redworms and what they can accomplish for you, but they each excel at different things. So it comes down to what are your primary goals with vermicomposting. If you look at the redworms versus soldier grubs, one of the things that people want to do is they want to create compost for their plants or create compost tea, that sort of thing, and that's one of their primary reasons for having a vermiculture bin or vermicomposting bin, is to create compost for later use in gardening. Now, both of the soldier grubs and the redworms do create compost as a byproduct of them processing waste. I would say if your primary goal is compost creation, the advantage goes to the redworms simply because they leave more behind and it builds up quicker. I haven't emptied my soldier grub bin in almost a year now. So much of what they eat goes into the metabolic process of just growing for themselves that they don't leave as much behind. So there's not a lot of compost creation in terms of ratios of how much you put in there. Like 100 pounds of shit in the bin may not even leave 5 pounds of compost in there. That's how much they use just to grow. On the redworms, on the other hand, they live a lot longer. They stay, the worm is their adult form, so they're just living and eating. And they don't need to just grow up super quick and then pupate like the soldier grubs do. So they leave a lot more waste behind. They're a lot slower at processing, but they do leave a lot more compost behind. So if your primary goal is compost creation, then you're probably going to want to go with the redworms. Creating food for other animals. If your main goal is to have a bin that you can turn stuff like rotten vegetables or old food, stuff that you can't really feed your animals, into food for chickens and fish or reptiles, then my recommendation would be to go with the soldier grubs. The redworms can also create, and they create quite a bit too, but in terms of the volume of grubs that can come out of a soldier grub bin, there's no comparison. Just like with the compost, there's no comparison for the redworms. You can get pounds and pounds of grubs out of a grub bin, and that's where most of the waste goes. That's why you don't have a lot of compost left behind with the soldier grubs, is because so much of that goes into growing. And so you can get a pretty good conversion rate in terms of stuff you put in there in grub output, and they're self-collecting, which makes it easier if that's what you want is the grubs. They crawl off, dump into the bin, you don't have to dig through them like you would for worms. So if you have chickens or fish and your primary reason is to create something to feed them off of your waste, go with the soldier grubs. Disposing of waste. Both of these vermicomposting bins will get rid of your waste, whether that's yard or food clippings and stuff like that. Now there's a little bit of overlap in what they eat, but for the most part they both will dispose of your kitchen waste and stuff like that. The soldier grubs, again, are much faster at getting rid of waste, so if your primary goal is to see stuff put in there and have it disappear and have room for more stuff in the next day, then I would go with the soldier grubs, because nothing else can compete with them in terms of how quickly they get rid of stuff. Maybe pigs or something, but in terms of vermicomposting, the soldier grubs can't be beat in terms of how quickly they process waste. Various climates. Both of these can be found and used in the redworms and the soldier grubs locations all over the country, in other countries as well. But if I had to give an advantage, I would say it went to the redworms in terms of where you can get away with having a bin, simply because in a lot of the colder climates in Midwest and North, you're not going to have an indigenous population of the black soldier flies. They won't be able to survive a really cold winter like that. That's why you kind of see them in the south all along the country. It could be southwest, southeast, but typically it's more in the southern areas of the country because they are not as tolerant to the cold, while the redworms can survive year-round in much more cold climates than can the soldier grubs. Both of them are going to slow down considerably in the winter, and you can heat your bin if you're interested and keep the process going for both of them, but the adults are just not going to be able to make it year-round with the soldier flies in a lot of those really cold climates. So if that's a primary concern for you and you don't have like a greenhouse or anything like that, and I would go with the redworms, because even during the summer you're probably going to have to buy the soldier grubs and get them in maybe even every year, unless you can culture some sort of adult climate, they can year-round breed in on your property. You're going to have to order them. So if you're in a cold area, go with the redworms. Processing bad waste like meats or manure, both of them can do that. I will say that the the redworms are a lot pickier about what type of manures and stuff they'll really thrive in, and the meats, while they will go after meats, they really don't like it as much as the plant waste, and it will sit there for a lot longer, which means you may have raccoons and stuff get into the bin. You'll have a lot more problem with flies and other pests coming after the meat and manure than you would with the soldier grubs. The soldier grubs will eat manure, they'll eat meat just as quickly as anything else, so if your primary goal is to be able to process like bad waste like that and stuff that you wouldn't normally put in a compost pile, you're going to want to go with the black soldier flies. The worms just aren't fast enough and don't prefer that enough for that to be the best option for you. Now on the other hand, processing stuff that's high in cellulose, yard clippings like grass, leaves, and anything like cardboard or paper, the soldier grubs really can't process that kind of cellulose. They need something that would more of like the meaty part. Basically, if it would smell bad after a while of leaving it sitting out, that's what the soldier grubs will like. They like fruit, they like meat, they'll like the stalks and leaves of some plants, but they're not going to eat cardboard or paper. They're really not going to go after like grass clippings and leaves, and they're not going to be able to process a lot of that high cellulose plant matter. So if that's what you find yourself with a lot of, then you're going to want a redworm bin. And that's one of the reasons I have both, because someone like the rinds, and if you put a tomato in the black soldier fly bin, they will eat everything but the skin and leave like a papery thin skin in there, and that is perfect for the redworms. And I've actually read an article, I haven't tested this out myself, but I've heard that if you take the compost from the soldier grub bin when it's done and put it in the redworm bin, the redworms love it and they grow faster than they would normally. They process it even more completely than what was already done by the soldier grubs, because the soldier grubs will leave a lot of that high cellulose stuff behind, and it makes for even better compost, and it's really good for the redworms. So that's another reason why it's good to have both. But if your main reason is to process high cellulose stuff, get rid of some cardboard, get rid of some yard clippings and leaves, go with the redworms. Now for ease of use, that's the last one. Both of them, in terms of what you do once you have the bin set up, is fairly simple. You put the stuff in and you just let them eat it. With the soldier grub bins, it's a little more symptomatic in terms of just putting the waste in there. You can just throw it in there and they eat it so quickly that there's really nothing to think about. You just throw it in there and they eat it. Whereas with the redworms, you sort of have to like cover it up sometimes or move it around the bin so it doesn't pile up, and there's a little bit more thought that needs to go into what you do with the waste. You can't just dump a bunch of stuff in there like you can sometimes with the soldier grub bin once it's an active colony. But as far as the bin goes, it's way easier to set up a redworm bin. The bin itself, like obviously you want to set up properly like I showed in my other videos in terms of having the right bedding and the right circumstances, whereas the soldier grubs are pretty tolerant in terms of bad bin conditions. They'll still grow and everything, but if you're wanting to get the crawl off set up properly, if you're wanting to harvest the mature grubs, that can be really problematic, and it's going to be really hard to set. Not terribly hard, but you have to be pretty specific in building your bin for it to have good crawl off rates. So, and that's why I eventually bought the biopod, even though it was ridiculously expensive, is because I wanted to make sure I saw how it was working properly. And it works great, but they're really expensive. So the ease of use is probably much easier with the redworms in terms of just a normal bin processing waste like it's supposed to and everything. Easier to set up with the redworms simply because of the way the bins can be made out of anything. Whereas with the soldier grubs, you can have just a bin like that, but then they're going to be trying to crawl out over the place, or they won't be able to crawl out, and you won't be able to harvest the mature grubs. So if you're just worrying about waste processing, then you can probably make a more simple bin. But if you want to harvest the mature grubs, which is one of the big advantages of having the soldier grubs, you're going to want to make a proper bin with a ramp, or buy one of the biopods, and I'll put a link to those if you want to check them out. And you can get all sorts of souped up worm farms and stuff too, where they're, migrate up and you can just add more in different levels. But from what I've seen and everyone else that has done this on YouTube and everything that I've checked out, it doesn't seem like those are really necessary. Like, sure, they're cool and everything, but for the prices, you can't beat like a $5 tote that you've just drilled a couple holes in. And so that's a big advantage of the redworms. So hopefully that was helped you guys out if you're trying to decide one way or the other. I recommend, if you're in a climate that can support it, just to do both, and there's no reason not to do both. There's a lot of overlap, but there's also some things that one does better than the other, as I've showed you in this video, so you have options for everything. But if you can't do both, hopefully the information in this video has helped you out deciding what you want to do. So let me know if you have any further questions. I'll try to answer them. I'm by no means a super expert on the subject, but I have managed to build up a little bit of practical experience trying this stuff out. So hopefully that helped, guys. I'll talk to you later.